The last thing I felt was cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from winter or from standing too long in the shadow of a great building. No, this was the cold that lives inside a person. The kind you collect, quietly, over years of being treated like furniture, like a useful thing, present but unseen. I remember the exact color of the sky the moment I died. It was that particular shade of gray that comes just before dawn, not dark enough to be night, not brave enough to be morning. Undecided, hovering. Like me. Like everything I had ever been in that world. I was 23 years old, shadow rank, assigned to the household of Lord Alaric Voss since I was 14. 9 years of folding his correspondence, of standing 3 steps behind him at council gatherings, of memorizing the exact way he took his morning tea, no sweetener, a single drop of something bitter, served at precisely 68 degrees, because anything hotter and he'd set it aside without drinking it, and then it would be my fault somehow, wouldn't it? It would be my failure, my inadequacy made visible in a cup of cooling tea. 9 years. And in 9 years, I don't believe Lord Alaric Voss ever once said my name. Not once. I was the shadow. That was the formal address for those of us in servant rank, a linguistic elegance, the highborn called it, to give our function a title rather than burden themselves with the intimacy of our actual names. We were shadows. We existed to attend, to absorb, to follow, to cast no shape of our own. And yet, God's help me, I loved him. I know how that sounds, I do. I've had time to examine it from every angle, and I understand that what I felt was shaped by proximity, by the particular vulnerability of being young and powerless in the orbit of someone who seemed utterly untouchable. I understand the psychology of it now. But understanding a thing and being free of it are 2 entirely different rooms, and in that old world, I never found the door out. He was cold. Lord Alaric was cold in the way that certain beautiful things are cold. Marble and still water, and the first light of winter through a window you're not allowed to open. There was a precision to him, a composure that never slipped. I had watched him receive news of political betrayal and personal loss with the same exact expression, a slight tightening around the eyes, a breath taken a half-second longer than usual, and then nothing. The mask restored, perfect, impenetrable. I used to lie awake at night and wonder what it would take to make him break, what it would feel like to see something real move across that face. I found out at the end. The assassination attempt came on a Tuesday. I remember because it was the day the first cold rain of autumn arrived, and I had spent the morning sourcing a specific variety of tea that Lord Alaric had mentioned once in passing that he had enjoyed as a child. I had walked 3 districts to find it. I had it wrapped in paper in my coat pocket when the man with the blade came out of the corridor shadow. There was no time for thought. That is the honest truth. There was no heroic calculation, no noble decision arrived at through moral clarity. My body simply moved. 9 years of training to place myself between Lord Alaric and any potential harm, and my body had learned the lesson better than my conscious mind ever could. The blade was meant for his heart. It found mine instead. I remember the weight of it. I remember the cold of the stone floor as I went down, and I remember... This is the part I have turned over in my hands 1,000 times since. I remember Lord Alaric's face, finally cracked open. He knelt over me on that floor. Lord Alaric Voss, who did not kneel for anyone, who had stood unmoved at the funerals of princes. He knelt on that cold stone, and his hands, I could feel his hands, pressing, urgent and shaking. And his face was broken. Not composed, not masked, broken, like something had shattered behind his eyes all at once, and what was underneath was not the cold I expected. It was fear, raw and formless and human. He looked at me the way I had always, in the private shame of my own heart, wanted him to look at me. And I remember thinking, in the gray, fading edges of my consciousness, how unbearably, bitterly funny. He finally sees me, and I'm dying. I felt his voice more than heard it. Sound was going strange by then, pulling away like a tide, and I think he said my name. I think, for the first and last time in 9 years, he said my actual name. But I couldn't be sure. I couldn't hold on long enough to be sure. And then there was darkness. And then there was light. Not the darkness I expected, not the quiet nothing of an ending. Light. Warm, golden, filtering through curtains I didn't recognize, in a room that was enormous. The ceiling was carved stone and pale oak beams, and there were flowers on a side table, fresh flowers, the expensive kind, and the sheets beneath me were... Gods, the sheets! I had slept on a service pallet for 9 years, and these sheets felt like lying in a cloud that had been raised on a diet of cashmere and good intentions. I sat up. My first thought was that I had made some error, that I had wandered in death into someone else's afterlife, that there had been an administrative mistake in whatever system sorted souls and I had been filed in the wrong place. My second thought came when I caught my reflection in the mirror across the room. I stood slowly. I walked to it on legs that felt wrong, not painful, just new somehow, differently weighted. And I stood in front of that mirror and I looked at myself for a long, silent moment. Same face, same eyes, that particular shade of deep brown that I had never thought remarkable, but that seemed somehow, in this light, in this room, to hold something I didn't recognize. Steadiness, weight, authority. And on my chest, visible above the neckline of a sleeping shirt that cost more than my entire previous wardrobe, the crest. The high-rank crest. I touched it with 2 fingers. It was warm, slightly raised, like a scar that had healed into something elegant. I knew what it meant. Every person in the rank system knew what it meant from childhood. The crest of the highborn meant power, protection, precedence. It meant doors opened before you. It meant your name was spoken first in every room. I was shadow rank. I had been shadow rank since I was old enough to understand the word meant. And yet here, in this room, in this body that was mine and yet somehow more than the one I remembered, here was the crest, undeniable. Golden at my chest like a promise or a challenge or some cosmic joke I hadn't yet understood the punchline of. I stood at that mirror for what felt like a very long time. And then someone knocked at my chamber door. "My lord," the voice was professional, contained. "It is the hour of your morning dressing, if you are ready." I turned around, and the world, this new, bewildering, impossible world, tilted completely on its axis. Because standing in the doorway, holding a carefully folded set of formal robes over an arm, dressed in the gray and silver of a household servant, with a service collar at his throat, was Lord Alaric Moss. No. Let me be precise, because precision matters here, and I need you to understand exactly what I was experiencing in that moment, because it was not a single feeling, it was not clean, it was 15 feelings simultaneously, crashing into each other like badly timed waves, and I needed every ounce of whatever strange new composure this body and this rank seemed to have gifted me to simply stand still, to simply breathe. He looked the same. Of course he looked the same. It had only been a night. My rational mind understood that I had not somehow time-traveled into the far future, that this was a parallel world, not a future one. And so the face in front of me was the face I knew. Sharp jaw, pale as winter, hair that fell across his forehead in a way that his former household staff had been never permitted to remark upon, but that I had privately, quietly noted approximately 10,000 times. Those gray eyes, the color of the undecided sky that had been above me when I died. Calm, professional, asking nothing. But there was the collar, the servant's collar at his throat, the service mark at his wrist, just visible below the cuff of his gray uniform, and the way he stood, 3 steps inside the doorway, head slightly inclined, waiting for permission to approach, that particular posture of alert, invisible readiness that I knew from the inside, that I had lived from the inside. That was the posture of a person who had learned to make themselves small while remaining functional. 9 years of mornings I had stood in that posture, outside his door, holding his robes, waiting for his word that I could enter. And now here was Alaric Voss doing the same. For me. I don't know how long I stood there without speaking. Long enough that he looked up, a brief professional check, the kind of look that asks, "Have I done something wrong?" without quite allowing the question to be audible. And our eyes met. He didn't know me. That was immediately, devastatingly clear. He looked at me with the polite, attentive blankness of a well-trained servant looking at the Lord they serve, and there was nothing in it. No recognition, no flash of that broken face I had taken with me into death. Nothing. He didn't know me, and I knew him completely. I knew the precise temperature at which he preferred his morning tea. I knew that he had a small scar on his right hand from a childhood accident he had never, in my hearing, discussed with anyone. I knew that on the rare occasions when something genuinely moved him, he went very still and quiet, and the muscle in his jaw tightened twice, exactly twice before he recovered himself. I knew that he was allergic to a particular kind of wood polish, and that the household staff in the old world had been quietly instructed to use a substitute, and I would wager that no one in this world had thought to find that out yet. And so he was probably... I filed that away immediately, something clenching in my chest that I couldn't quite name yet. My lord? A gentle inquiry. Professional, not impatient. He had been trained well in this world, and the thought of that, the thought of Alaric Voss being trained to wait patiently while someone gathered their thoughts, sent something complicated and hot through the center of my chest. Yes, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Come in. He approached and began the process of laying out the formal robes with practiced efficiency, and I stood in front of the mirror and watched his reflection move behind me, and tried, very quietly, very firmly, to manage the civil war happening inside my ribcage. Part of me wanted to hate him. I want to be honest about that. Part of me, the part that had spent 9 years invisible and 9 years in love with a man who looked straight through me, the part that died on a cold floor while wondering if he would even remember my name by the following week, that part felt something dark and electric move through it at the sight of him in a servant's uniform. A voice that said, "Now you know. Now you understand what it felt like. Every single morning for 9 years, this is what it felt like." I am not proud of that voice, but I'm not going to pretend it wasn't there. I think pretending it wasn't there would be a kind of lie, and whatever I am now, whatever strange mercy dropped me into this new life, I think I owe it honesty at least. But there was the other part. The part that had walked 3 districts in the cold rain to find specific tea just because he had mentioned it once years ago and had never seemed to remember mentioning it at all. The part that had learned the exact angle of morning light in his study so I could position his correspondence in the best reading position before he arrived. The part that had, and gods, this is embarrassing, this is genuinely embarrassing, but I said I would be honest. The part that had, on exactly 3 occasions over 9 years, been close enough to him that I could have reached out and touched his hand, and had instead pressed my own hand against my legs so hard I left marks, because to reach out would have been wrong. Would have been too much, would have overstepped every boundary that the rank system and basic self-preservation had drawn around me. That part looked at Alaric Voss standing quietly in a servant's uniform and felt something that was not triumph. That felt something that was much, much softer and much more dangerous than triumph. It felt protective, which was new, which was entirely, disorientingly new. Because in the old world, I had never been permitted to protect anyone. I had only ever been protected, or not, as it turned out in the end, by the arbitrary goodwill of those above me. But here, in this body, with this crest warm at my chest, here, Protection was something I could offer, and the realization of that in the presence of this specific person did something strange and fundamental to the architecture of whatever I was becoming in this new world. He finished laying out the robes, stepped back, inclined his head, waiting. "What is your name?" I asked. A fractional pause. Not long. He recovered quickly, well-trained, but I caught it. The slight recalibration of a person who has been asked a question they did not expect from the person asking it. "Alaric, my lord, of the Voss service line." Voss service line. In this world, the family that had once ruled a third of the high councils was a service line. The names that had made lesser men step back in hallways were now a designation of staff origin. I let none of that move across my face. "Alaric," I said, the way you say a word you have been holding in your mouth for a long time without speaking it, carefully, with full awareness of its weight. "You may begin." And as he helped me dress, with the same quiet efficiency he had once expected from me, I watched his face in the mirror and I thought, this is the most awake I have ever been in either of my lives. The morning council session was my first real test of this new world's rules. I had spent the hours between dressing and the session in a quiet, focused state of absorption, reading the documents left on my desk, which my steward, which still sounds extraordinary, had prepared, establishing who I was in this world, what my holdings were, what my council position entailed. Kieran of House Adon, high rank, third tier of the inner council, significant political capital, known, apparently, for a certain strategic precision in council debate that had earned me both allies and enemies in roughly equal measure. I found I had instincts for it. Muscle memory of a different kind. This body had lived this life for 23 years, and some of that lived knowledge sat just below my conscious reach, available when I needed it. Like knowing how to walk or how to breathe. I didn't have to learn to be high rank. I simply inhabited it, carefully, like wearing someone else's coat that happened to fit perfectly. What I was less prepared for was watching Alaric be treated like furniture. He attended me at the session, which I gathered was standard practice. High-rank lords brought their primary household servant to council as a combination of status display and practical attendance. I did not love this, but I noted it, filed it, and focused on navigating the session without revealing that I had, technically, been in this world for approximately 6 hours. Lord Kassan noticed Alaric first. Kassan was the kind of man who existed in every iteration of every power structure in every world, large in his own estimation, smaller in actuality, compensating constantly. He had the hearty, carrying voice of someone who wanted their cruelty witnessed because witnessed cruelty to them was a performance of status. And he fixed on Alaric the moment we entered the council antechamber with the focused attention of someone identifying a target. "Voss line," he said, loud enough for the nearest 4 people to hear, looking at Alaric with the particular brand of amused disdain that requires a living person to be treated as an object of entertainment. "You're still running the Adon house? I heard you keep you on the council floor now. Dropped considerably, haven't you?" Alaric's face did not change. And this was the moment that broke something open in me, because I recognized that face. I knew that face from inside, that particular blankness that is not emptiness, but is instead a very highly trained act of self-containment. The face of someone who has learned that any visible reaction will be used against them, and so has made themselves a smooth, unreflective surface, and waits for the commentary to pass the way you wait for rain. He said nothing. He inclined his head a precise, professional degree, and Kassan laughed, that particular laugh that is not actually amused but is using the shape of amusement to deliver harm, and turned to say something to the man beside him. I moved before I thought about it. "Lord Kassan." My voice in this body had a particular quality I was still getting used to. It carried without effort, clear and even, and it had a kind of gravity that made people turn. Several people turned. Kassan turned. "I don't believe the antechamber is the appropriate setting for commentary on household arrangements, unless you'd like to raise it as a formal agenda item." The question was delivered pleasantly, That was important, pleasantly, with the particular surface smoothness of someone who is not angry but is also not going to be moved, and whose formal title gives them the standing to make the offer of formal agenda items sound less like an invitation and more like a very precise warning. Kassan blinked, recalibrated, smiled the smile of someone who has just been checked and is deciding whether to push back or absorb it. He absorbed it, because I was high rank, third tier, and he was second tier, and the math was simple. "No need," he said, still using the hearty voice but now with its edges pulled back slightly. "No offense intended to your household, Adon." "None taken," I said, on anyone's behalf. And I moved forward and did not look back at Alaric, because looking back would have been too much, would have made it something it wasn't yet ready to be, and I felt at my back, without seeing it, something shift in the posture of the man walking 3 steps behind me, something almost infinitesimally less contained. The recess between sessions gave us 20 minutes. I brought him to one of the small attendance corridors that bordered the main council hall. I had spent enough of my life in attendance corridors to know their geography intuitively, and there was something briefly wryly funny about that. I stood at the narrow window that looked out over the inner courtyard, and I said without turning, "Are you all right?" This, I knew, was a dangerous question. In the rank system, in either version of it I had experienced, "Are you all right?" directed at a servant by a lord was either a trap or a formality, and the correct answer to both was some variation of, "Perfectly well, my lord, thank you for your concern," delivered with no emotional content, to demonstrate that you understood the question was rhetorical. I waited. "My lord?" Measured, checking the terrain. "I'm not asking as your lord." I turned then, looked at him. He was standing correctly, the 3-step distance, the alert stillness, and his face was composed, and his eyes were watchful, and he looked so completely like the man I had spent 9 years, silently, hopelessly orbiting, that something very old and very tired moved through me like a current. "I am accustomed to it," he said, finally, and then as if the words had surprised him on the way out, "But, thank you, my lord." "Kieran," I said. He blinked. "My lord?" "My name is Kieran. You don't have to. You can use it when we're not in council." The look on his face. I have thought about that look many times since. It wasn't gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. It was the look of someone who has been handed something they weren't expecting and doesn't quite know where to put it. Not because they don't want it, but because all the shelves in that particular room were emptied out a long time ago, and they aren't sure it's safe to start filling them again. He said nothing else, but he nodded. And for just a moment before the professional blankness reassembled itself, I saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. Twice. Exactly twice. And I turned back to the window before he could see what was happening on my face. The rest of the day moved through me like a strange dream, the familiar rhythms of a life I had never lived but somehow knew, the strangeness of sitting in the high seat and speaking with a voice that carried, and watching doors open and watching people orient toward me the way that, in another world, they had oriented toward the man who was now walking quietly behind me. And I watched him, when I could do it without being obvious. I learned this new version of him in pieces, in stolen glances and careful attention, the way I had learned the old one, because the method, it turned out, was the same regardless of which side of the rank line I was standing on. Observation, patience, the ability to receive information quietly without reacting to it. He was different. Not entirely. The precision was still there, the composure, the strange contained quality that made him seem like something that existed a few degrees apart from the ordinary world, but there was something underneath it that the old Alaric had not had, or had not shown, or had buried too deep for me to reach from the distance he maintained between us. Vulnerability. Real, unarmored human vulnerability, the kind that comes from having been reduced, from having been brought down from a height and made to understand that you were not, after all, untouchable. He carried it carefully, the way you carry something that's been broken and repaired, functional but aware of its own fractures. I knew that feeling too. And somewhere in the long, strange hours of that first day, the dark part of me, the part that had wanted him to understand, to know, to feel the particular cold of being overlooked, went quiet, because he had already known. He had already learned it. This world had already taught him. And what I felt in the silence where that dark voice had been was something I hadn't expected. I felt sorry. Not in the diminishing way, not in the way that pities from a distance, in the way that recognizes, I know this room you're standing in. I have been in this room, and I would not wish it on anyone, not even you, not even the version of you that never said my name. That was when I understood what I was going to do. I asked him to stay after the evening duties were complete. This was unusual, I gathered. It broke the standard structure of the day, which ended with the household servant performing a final accounting of the next day's schedule and then withdrawing to the servants' wing. He stayed because I asked him to, and because I was his lord, and in this world, that was still how it worked. But I was done with how it worked. We were alone, the two of us in the main chamber, and the fire was low, and the evening was quiet, and he stood in the correct place, 3 steps from the chair where I sat, and waited, professionally, patiently, for whatever I needed. I looked at him for a long moment, at the collar at his throat, at the service mark at his wrist, at the face I had memorized in another life and carried into this one. "Sit down," I said. "Please." "My lord." "Kieran," gently. "And please, sit." He sat. He chose the chair at the careful social distance a servant would choose, not beside me, but not at the other end of the room either. The middle distance of someone who is trying to correctly read a situation that doesn't have a protocol. He sat with his hands on his knees and his spine very straight and his eyes on me, watchful and uncertain, and in the firelight, with the evening quiet around us, so human that it almost undid me. I've been thinking about how to say what I said next, and I've decided the only way to say it is to say it the way I said it then. Not constructed, not managed, just the truth. Undecorated. Because I had been practicing decorated truth for 9 years and it had gotten me a cold stone floor and a man saying my name too late, and I was not going to do that again. Not in this life. "I know this isn't normal," I said. "What I'm about to say and what I'm about to do is not normal within the current conventions of the rank system, and I understand if it's confusing or if it's unwelcome, or if you'd prefer I simply didn't, but I need to say it anyway." He was very still, listening. "You deserve better than what this world has given you," I said. "And I don't mean that in the abstract way that people say it at formal equality discussions. I mean you, specifically, sitting in that chair right now. You are—" I stopped, started again. "There is something in you that I have never stopped seeing across every circumstance, in every configuration. A kind of steadiness, an integrity that doesn't depend on what room you're standing in or what title is attached to your name. And I think that quality is remarkable. And I think this world has spent considerable effort trying to make you forget that it's there." His face. I want to describe his face, and I don't quite have words large enough for it. He was still composed, because he was Ulrich Voss, and composure was the architecture of him, but the light behind it had changed. Something was happening behind those gray eyes that was not professional and was not managed, and was not the smooth, trained surface of a servant at work. He looked struck, the way lightning strikes something, not destructively, but with a force that completely reorganizes what it touches. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Why?" His voice, for the first time since I'd known this version of him, was not quite level. "Why would you say that to me?" "Because it's true," I said, "and because I think you needed to hear it, and because—" And here I stood up, and I crossed to him, and I sat not 3 steps away, but in the chair beside his, close enough that I could see the exact particular gray of his eyes in the firelight, close enough that when he breathed, the air between us shifted, and I watched him not pull back, not recalibrate the distance, watched him sit very still in the way that meant he was paying complete attention. "I'm not interested in being your lord," I said. "I have lived enough of my life inside the rank system to know that the things it asks us to perform are not the things that matter. What matters is that, when I look at you, I don't see a servant. I have never seen a servant. I see someone I would very much like to know, as an equal, if that's something you would want." He stopped, looked at his own hands, then back up at me. "Kieran." And the way he said it, my name, just my name, not with the trained professional courtesy of a servant using a granted permission, but with something real in it, something uncertain and careful and reaching. I felt it move through me like warmth moving through a room that has been cold for a very long time. I reached out and took his hand. Not the way I had pressed my own hand against my leg in another life, leaving marks, stopping myself. I reached out and I took his hand, and I held it in both of mine, this hand that I knew, that I had seen sign documents and hold a blade and press against the floor of a corridor while I was dying, and I held it like it was something worth holding. He let me. He looked down at our hands, then up at my face, and the mask, the extraordinary, exhausting, lifelong mask, shifted just slightly, just enough. The jaw did not tighten, the eyes did not go smooth. Something arrived in his face that I do not have a single perfect word for, so I'll use several: relief and wonder, and the particular kind of vulnerability that comes when a person has been very lonely for a very long time and is only just now allowing themselves to realize how much. I reached into my coat pocket with my free hand and withdrew the small tool that the steward had given me that morning with the list of household administrative privileges, a High Lord's official seal, among other things. I turned it to the particular function I had spent the afternoon quietly researching, the one that was technically within my authority, but had not, I gathered, been used by anyone in living memory. Voluntary rank release. The formal dissolution of a service bond originated by the ranking party. I pressed it to the service mark at his wrist. It faded. The mark, that designation, that claiming, it faded from his wrist like ink washed clean, and I watched it go and felt something that I can only describe as the sensation of a door opening in a room I had assumed was a wall. "You don't belong to this house," I said. "You don't belong to any rank or line or system. You are," I held his unmarked wrist, "you are just Alaric, if you want to be." Then, when he finally spoke, his voice was low and unsteady and more real than anything I had heard from him in either of my lives. "I don't know," he said, "what to do with this." "That's all right," I said. "Neither do I." And then, because something in me that had been heavy for 23 years had at last put itself down, "We can figure it out." He looked at me. I looked at him. The fire was warm and the evening was quiet, and the rank system was, for this moment in this room, entirely irrelevant, a structure built by frightened people to organize a world that had not needed that particular kind of organization, and that would, I had decided, occupy no more real estate in my heart or my choices going forward. I had been shadow rank. I had been invisible and used and overlooked. I had loved someone from a distance, so practiced and so careful that the love itself had become a kind of silence, a held breath, a pressing of my hand against my leg. I had died on a cold stone floor without knowing if my name would be remembered. And I had woken up here, in this life, with this crest, with this extraordinary, bewildering second chance. And Alaric Voss was sitting beside me, not above me, not behind me, beside me, his warm, unmarked wrist in my hands, looking at me like I was something he didn't have a word for yet, but that he was beginning, cautiously, with all the careful attentiveness of someone who has learned the hard way that hope requires tending, he was beginning to want. I am not a god. I am not a savior. I am a man who has been given a strange gift, the memory of what it costs to be unseen, and the power now to make sure that the person sitting beside me never has to know that cost again. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the largest thing I have ever held in my hands. And I am going to hold it carefully, the way something matters to you when you almost didn't get the chance to hold it at all. My name is Kiran of House Adan. I was shadow rank for 9 years, and I died cold on a corridor floor. And I woke up in a world where everything was reversed, and I was given a choice, to let the reversal be a revenge or to let it be a beginning. I choose the beginning, for both of us. I choose it on behalf of every morning I stood invisible in a doorway with his tea at the right temperature, and every night I pressed my hand against my leg and didn't reach out, and every single moment in between when I was less than I should have been allowed to be. I choose it because he is different here, in this world, cracked open and uncertain and learning and worth it. He is so completely worth it. And because, in the moment I was dying, with everything fading and the cold coming in, he said my name. I don't know if it was too late then, but it is not too late now. It is not too late. The fire, his breathing, and mine, the soft, settled quiet of something finally beginning.
The end.